Hello and welcome to the fifth and final week of the Open University's MOOC on genocide. In our last week here, we'll discuss two interesting and shocking case studies, perhaps as much as other cases we've discussed in the beginning of the semester, and to a certain extent perhaps even more so. I'm talking about the extermination of the indigenous populations of North and South America. First, we start with 3 lectures on the events in the South American regions under Spanish rule, especially during the 16th century, during which researchers estimated that 40 to 50 million Native Americans were exterminated and died of epidemics. That is an inconceivable amount. Today, we'll talk about the general background story of Spain's conquest of South America, and also briefly review the local cultures that flourished there before the Spanish arrived. I will also describe how the Spanish conquerors took over the 2 major empires in the areas that eventually came under Spanish rule, the Aztec and Inca empires. Then in the next lecture this week, we will ask the important question: was there a real genocide in Latin America, or maybe something else? In our 3rd lecture this week, we will host the author of the book by Dr. Eitan Ginsberg, posted on the course website, which we use here in our study of this subject at the Open University's Genocide course. Dr. Ginsberg spent years studying the destruction of the indigenous population in Latin America. Later, during the week, we will briefly discuss the situation in the United States in the 19th century and the disappearance of millions of Native Americans who lived in what eventually became the United States. We will focus on that subject in the 2 final lectures of the week, which actually conclude the entire course. So I just set our work plan, and with your permission, I will now briefly describe what happened in Latin America from the moment Christopher Columbus set foot on the shores of the American continent in 1492, or actually on one of the islands nearby South America, as well as what happened under Spanish rule during the 16th century. You know that Columbus may have arrived in America by accident, right? We all know that he actually wanted to go to India, which is why he called the natives Indians when he discovered America. This name stuck to the Indians to this day, even though it is a politically incorrect term. And yet I think some of us still use the term Indians when we talk about the indigenous population of North and South America. It seems that Columbus himself did not know that he had discovered a new continent until his death. He believed he had indeed reached India, although he returned to Spain and later sailed back to the Americas twice more. However, shortly after the discovery of the continent, the Europeans already know that it is indeed a new world. Perhaps one of the first indications of that is the papal decree, the so-called papal bulla, issued by the Vatican in Rome in 1493. Under this bulla, the then Pope Alexander VI divides the New World between Spain and Portugal, the 2 major Catholic empires at the time, and states openly that the people residing within the New World are free and must not be converted by force. Soon I'll explain why this point is so significant and crucial for this discussion on genocide, which, as you remember, usually must be planned in advance and committed deliberately. Such a papal decree as the one issued by Alexander VI suggests that as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, there was no genocide and certainly nothing planned or premeditated by anyone in the Church. To support this statement, I will note very generally that even the kings of Spain, including those who sent Columbus to America, known as the Catholic monarchs Fernando and Isabel, who unified Spain in 1492, as well as several other kings throughout the 16th century, unambiguously considered the native population of South America as free people, not to be enslaved nor converted to Christianity by force. This attitude, held both by the established church and the ruling Spanish crown, is quite strikingly in conflict with what actually happened in South America during the 16th century. The Spanish conquest of the South American territories was gradual. It started with the establishment of several colonies, at first in Cuba and later within the continent as well. To a certain extent, it seems the extermination of the magnificent local South American cultures was the initiative of private individuals, as strange as that may sound. The first conquest of a real empire in South America began in 1519. I'm talking about the Aztec Empire. Although it wasn't too old, founded in the 1520s, it was a very strong empire whose warriors were known for their cruelty. This empire was very advanced technologically and architecturally. This relatively advanced culture had a polytheistic religion, a developed pagan religion with mythology, a creation story, an apocalypse story, an end-of-time story, and an organized governing hierarchy led by an absolute ruler. The king of the Aztec Empire in 1519 was Moctezuma, or the commonly distorted version of his name Montezuma, based mainly on Rider Haggard's novel from the 19th century. In 1519, a Spanish adventurer named Hernán Cortés arrives there with a rather ridiculously small group of soldiers. We're talking about a mission of 500 warriors under his command, 11 ships, 16 horses with riders, and some artillery. Cortés hears about this empire and finds out there's a lot to plunder. So he goes on his own quest to conquer the empire independently, without any approval from the Spanish governor in Cuba, and of course without any approval from the King of Spain himself. He reaches the area of the Gulf of Mexico, the home of the Aztec Empire, which in the previous decades enslaved a number of nations, and cleverly uses interpreters to form an alliance with local nations eager to be freed from Aztec rule, with the help of the Spanish conquistador. Without going into too much detail, which in any case appears in Eitan Ginsberg's excellent book, we see that the alliance Cortés makes with local leaders who want to rebel against the oppressive rule of the Aztecs bears fruit ultimately. But even before that, I want to point out one or two interesting facts. On his way to the capital of the Aztec Empire, Cortés and his men commit an appalling massacre in the Aztec city of Cholula. He arrives there with his soldiers and kills nearly 30,000 people, almost overnight. It is clear that he is sending a message to the Aztec king Moctezuma, who sits in the Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan. The king gets word of the shocking news about the massacre of those 30,000 men and women in Cholula and is evidently deeply moved. Cortés and his men arrive at the gates of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan, which open up for them as if they were gods. They enter the capital city honorably, enjoy a king's welcome, are housed in Moctezuma's palace, and receive excellent treatment. To this day, we do not know exactly what brought the mighty king of the Aztecs, who could have ordered his troops to kill Cortés and his 500 men in a flash. Not to do it, but rather let this Spanish conquistador straight into the heart of the capital. Either way, Cortés doesn't dilly-dally. He immediately jails the Aztec king in his chambers and treats the capital as if it were his own. His men are pampered, including women brought to sleep with them, and get everything they need. And thus, a few days go by until the aristocratic nobles of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, realize something is wrong. It reaches the point where one day their king, Moctezuma, looks out from the balcony of his room where he is locked in his quarters and is stoned by an angry mob. Then Cortés and his men luckily manage to escape from the capital and prepare for the final battle over the Aztec Empire, which takes place shortly after. In this battle, Cortés, alongside with the local Native American army of about 150,000 troops, fights the Aztec army of 300,000 soldiers and eventually wins. This largely due to the fact that the smallpox epidemic brought by Cortés's men from Europe inflicts heavy casualties upon the Aztec army, which is mostly besieged behind the walls of Tenochtitlan. And thus comes to an end the history of the Aztec Empire, which faces its final doom. Another major conquest I will mention briefly is somewhat reminiscent of the conquest of the Aztec Empire, and this is the conquest conducted by another Spanish conqueror named Francisco Pizarro. He too, very similarly to the actions of Cortes, decides on his own to conquer the Inca Empire located in the southern Andes in the western part of South America. This rich and developed kingdom is also quite young, founded in the 1530s. In this case too, we see the Spanish conqueror Pizarro arriving in the area of the Incas with a total of 180 soldiers, 27 horsemen, and 2 guns. He too forges a political and military alliance with a brother of the Inca king Atahualpa, and with his help he manages to take over the empire. In this case as well, the king of the Inca, Atahualpa, welcomes the Spanish conqueror without any protection by his soldiers and without wearing armor, allowing him to handcuff and imprison him, strangely enough. A few months later, he is executed in the year 1533. The conquests of these two empires both unfold surprisingly and almost inconceivably easily. These two great empires are as rich and culturally developed as the Spanish conquerors to a great extent. This bizarrely easy occupation comes to an end, and in both cases we see each of these conquerors, Cortes in the case of the Aztecs and Pizarro in the case of the Incas, treat the conquered kingdoms as their own, handing them over to their soldiers as a prize, a bounty. And thus a new chapter in the history of Latin America begins, the Spanish rule. We will discuss this period in the next lecture. In the meantime, thank you and goodbye.